Hello, and welcome to lesson number 6 of Module 3, Healing Brain Masterclass, Cannabis for Prevention, Innovations for Memory Disorder and Diseases. I'm your host, John Malanca with The Sacred Plant. Nowadays, we can get a lot of data into our genetics pretty much at the drop of a dime. You can go online and request a sample kit and get genetic testing results delivered to your door in a matter of days. With this information, we were able to get a look at possible markers as precursors to disease and more. As it continues to expand, genetic testing now extends into cannabis treatment and prevention arena, as we've learned in early Sacred Plant webinars, and how we can use medical cannabis treatment for each of us individually from our perspective of our own DNA. But do we need genetic testing to discover if cannabis actually works as a preventive tool? What other kind of testing has been generated to help good doctors like Dr. Stein suggest cannabis for prevention? Let's take a look. So welcome back, Dr. Stein, and welcome back to the Sacred Plant family. Let's talk about prevention in cannabis and other alternative treatments. And what are your thoughts about, are there any tests about preventative measures like genetic testing? Has this come across your table yet?
It has.
And what are your thoughts, and have you used it? Are you using it?
I think for the most part, genetic testing for general consumption is not ready for prime time.
Okay.
We use genetic testing and have used genetic testing in the medical field for many years. It's very helpful for diagnosing conditions like Huntington's disease. We can use a genetic test to assess Alzheimer's risk in some individuals. We use genetic testing for all sorts of muscular dystrophies. Very helpful.
Yeah.
Someone in a family has an illness. They want to know what the risk is if they get married and have children. Sometimes we can provide that information.
Have you ever taken one of these DNA tests, 23andMe, Ancestry.com? Have you done those?
So Cindy gave me one for my birthday, and it's on my desk.
One thing that they say when you do get your results back, I don't know if it was before or after, but there's a box, and they bring up this box a few times to say, are you sure, are you sure? But they asked you, would you like to know about potential medical history? But this is what I mean, what we were talking about with, well, first off, I think you should go spit into it.
Well, this is my bias, right?
Yeah.
So we all have our biases, and I'm biased toward not believing the vast majority of information gleaned from those popular tests.
Yeah.
I have faith in the genetic tests that we do that I've seen the research on. And I know that there's a lot of popular information available about telomere length, for example, which is the length of certain chromosomes, and how in patients at risk for cancer, for example, the telomere length may not be what it should be. So what do you do with that information? You find out, okay, I have a short telomere. Then you go to your doctor, maybe your hair's on fire, maybe not, and say, I have this test result, what do I do now? And the doctor says, well, I've been screening you for cancer. I do that with all my patients. You know, you get your mammogram and so forth, colonoscopy, and we see no evidence of cancer. And then the patient says, but my test shows that I'm at high risk. Please do more testing. And then you know what happens? That patient is in what I call the vortex of medicine. The vortex of medicine is a situation where test after test results in more and more results that you don't know what to do with. And then you get a result you don't know what to do with. You start taking a medication that maybe you don't need. And before you know it, you're having side effects you never had. And you're in the vortex of medicine. So I would like to just emphasize to our listeners, avoid the vortex of medicine. Try not to have tests you don't need. And maybe, just maybe, some of those genetic tests provide information that we don't need. It's my opinion.
I love it. So thank you. And I appreciate your opinion. With your senior community, which you have quite a few of down here in the Sarasota, Florida area, are there any tests that you can help, that they can take to be ahead of the game just in case?
We do lots of testing to evaluate our seniors and other individuals for different problems. Genetic tests usually are not the things we do.
Okay.
Most genetic conditions make themselves known earlier in life. There is some genetic predisposition for early onset Alzheimer's and Parkinson's for that matter. Mm-hmm. But when patients get into their 60s, 70s, and 80s and 90s, a genetic test is probably not going to provide too much new information.
Okay. What about cognitive reserve? Can you talk about that and what you do with your patients?
Cognitive reserve, we see time and again, is an important factor in resilience
Okay.
in terms of losing cognitive function as you age. Individuals that are high functioning and intellectually motivated during their life as young people do better as old people. And we believe it has something to do with what's called cognitive reserve.
Okay.
It's the development of the brain, which is a form of neuroplasticity over time as a result of new information.
And do you see cannabis helping in that at all?
Well, I think cannabis can potentially help with learning, as well as in patients with Alzheimer's, memory problems, and so forth. But when it comes to cognitive reserve, it's a lifestyle.
Okay. People think that they come to a doctor and you do a protocol for them, and you come up with a protocol, and that you're sitting here and you're almost like a compound pharmacist making the cocktail, the cannabis cocktail, or the cannabinoid cocktail, as you mentioned it the other night on our show. That's not the case. You don't touch medicine. And can you share about what your role is as a doctor and what you do and what the majority of other cannabis doctors in the industry do?
Well, here in Florida, doctors that qualify patients to get medical marijuana, medical cannabis, are not allowed to touch the plant. Mm-hmm. In fact, we're not allowed to recommend a specific dispensary because there are these provisions that have to do with potential kickback. So the powers that be don't want the doctors to be tempted to recommend a certain dispensary that may result in some kind of financial remuneration. Fine. We're not supposed to touch the product or sell the product because then that would incentivize the doctor to push those meds onto that patient again for financial reasons.
Like what we have seen for years in the pharmaceutical industry, being a pharmaceutical rep.
That's what they do.
Yeah.
That's their job.
Yeah. They
need to get doctors to write those prescriptions, and they're motivated by whatever
trips and I mean that must have been a great era for doctors, huh?
Yeah, well, we went on a couple of those before they turned the faucet off.
Yeah.
But I will admit that type of physician pharmaceutical relationship does introduce bias.
Oh.
It does.
Yeah.
I would like to say that it didn't, but I believe it does to some degree. We're all subject to bias, and some of it is subconscious. So I don't think it's a bad thing to limit the amount of programs that pharmaceutical companies provide for doctors if it's not so much education and is more along the lines of bribery.
Yeah. Bribery. We can end on that one. Before we close out this lesson, can we talk about the pillars again? Because how important it is for brain health. Food, exercise, friendship. You mentioned education to add in there, but cannabis, and then picking up new hobbies. How important is that for brain health, healthy brain, or someone going through an ailment as awful as Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, dementia? Can you talk about that?
I believe that healthy lifestyle is very important for brain health. And we're learning about ways in which that applies that we didn't appreciate before. Things having to do with diet, for example. We're learning more about the microbiome, the bacterial population in our gut that has significant impact on our brain function. Again, this is not something that I learned in medical school back in '87. We're learning much more about it. And the cannabinoid system plays right into that. An unhealthy gut flora, we call it, flora, translates into less well brain function. And there's numerous papers and studies that show that.
So thank you for all your in-depth knowledge on this topic, especially Alzheimer's patients. With all the Alzheimer's patients that you're seeing, are you seeing a common denominator in regards to ratios? We talked about cannabis cocktails. When I talk about cannabis cocktails, it's having the different formulations, 4-to-1, 1-to-1, 8-to-1, and that's so important. Why ratios are very important over strain, and we've talked about strain in this series already. But what are you seeing with your Alzheimer's patients?
I see the best response in high CBD, low THC formulations.
Okay.
We call that the type 3 ratio.
Okay.
There's three types of ratios. There's type 1, which is high THC, low CBD. Type 2 is fairly equal amounts, right? And type 3 is high CBD, low THC. And type 3, the high CBD, low THC ratio, seems to work best for older patients, especially patients with Alzheimer's. The THC, though, is necessary. CBD alone in low dose can actually sometimes cause an alerting or activating type of response. And in individuals who have some anxiety already, a small amount of CBD may potentially worsen that condition.
I'm glad you say that because I share this all the time with people. The media has confused a lot of people, a lot of families, a lot of doctors saying CBD is wonderful, take as much as you want. And I've personally seen people have a psychoactive reaction on CBD. I've seen people who have had anxiety. It induces anxiety if they have too much. And so, again, everybody's body is different. So it's great to hear you say that, and you've seen it with your patients.
And it depends on where they get the CBD.
Thank you. Can you talk about that?
CBD comes in lots of different shapes and sizes now. It's so popular. Everybody is on the CBD bandwagon. Lots of vendors. The CBD from plants that have other molecules seem to be the best tolerated, whereas CBD isolates, which are basically laboratory-based CBD molecules with zero terpenes, zero other cannabinoids, those isolates seem to be the least well tolerated. In fact, when you take CBD as a medication and the initial dose may not work too well for you and you need to increase the dose, that's usually okay when you're using a full flower or a whole plant. There's different terms for this. But when you're using a compound that has a variety of cannabinoids and terpenes, but is mainly CBD,
Yes.
those patients do better over the long haul. With the CBD isolates, it doesn't usually work out too well at the high dose. Patients can lose effect. They can have side effects. It's something that I don't recommend usually. I like to recommend something that's closer to what nature provides, so that the entourage effect, as we've discussed, can come into play. And that includes a small amount of THC when appropriate. Some patients need more THC, but in the older patients, small amount, type 3 cannabis, primarily CBD, seems to do the trick.
And can you share with our listeners, and maybe even with your own practice, what you shared, that THC is not bad. It is beneficial, and it works together with CBD to create the entourage effect. I just know that if my father-in-law was on a straight CBD ratio, he would be here today. He needed that THC, and his ratio for cancer, I know we're not talking about cancer right here, was 4 parts THC, 1 part CBD. We work with a lot of seizure patients, and they find success adding some THC in there as well. And are you finding the same thing with your Alzheimer's patients?
Without a doubt, and not just in my clinic, but in research laboratories and clinics around the world. We're learning not only clinically how the ratio is most effective with some THC, but we're learning biochemically why that is. And don't get me going on the biochemistry here, because it's fascinating. I'll give you a little.
Okay.
In the brain, the CB1 receptors that are so important for neuronal function have a binding site for THC. But CBD only binds on the side. It's called the allosteric modulator. It's part of the receptor, but it's to the side. You don't get the full CB1 receptor effect on the nerve cell unless there's THC. CBD alone just doesn't do it. So even though CBD is good for some things, like childhood epilepsy, reducing anxiety at the proper dose in some people, it's not good in isolation for most things.
Well, I appreciate that, and thank you for adding to our toolbox. Also, how you mentioned weapons of choice to attack any type of illness and any type of disease. So I appreciate that. Hope you've learned a lot and you've been able to add this to your toolbox of information on treating Alzheimer's traditionally or with alternative medicines such as cannabis and other treatments, even the 6 pillars. We've added a pillar onto that list. So I look forward to have you join us on our live Q&A with Dr. Stein and myself, and please submit any questions you have. We're more than happy to answer them on air. And if you're unable to attend, please still submit your questions. We'll answer them on air, and you'll have all of this in your patient's portal. We'll see you in the next lesson. Thank you. We know that it's up to us to take care of our brains. When you look at your own life, stop and think about what you're doing now, today, that can strengthen the working memory and help prevent cognitive decline and more. Are you getting enough restful sleep? Balance and good nutrition? Movement and exercise? Learning a new skill? Take time to reflect and how you can take the big ideas from this lesson and see how they can best help you. And be sure to share these insights with your loved ones, helping to brighten them up as you do for yourself. I'm a big believer and student of paying it forward. In the next lesson, our last lesson of module number 3, what should a caregiver know? We'll go into the very big conversation of taking care of a loved one or a patient who is struggling with memory loss disease, and how you should be caring not only for the patient, but being mindful for yourself as well.